First, I want to say some practical things. The lecture will be about 35 to 40 minutes. After the lecture, you can ask some questions to Janie, and you can either raise your hands or put your question in the Q&A. And the little screens where we are now, where you can see us now, you can move them about on your computer wherever you want to. So that's more or less the practical things. I would like now to introduce Janie to the people who don't know her already. Janie Lightfoot is Director and Senior Conservator of Janie Lightfoot Textiles, and she started in 1977. It's based in northwest London. The studio has a long history of working with all kinds of institutions like national and international museums, heritage houses, palaces, and also textile dealers, auction houses, and collectors. Janie acts as a consultant to several major institutions, is an associate lecturer at the University of Arts London, and a frequent speaker at conservation and textile conferences. The Janie Lightfoot Textile Archive is made accessible to students and interns both in the UK and throughout the world. On her website, you can find more information about the project she has done. And she will now start her lecture. Have fun, and I'll see you after the lecture when you want to ask some questions.
Okay. Right, well, thank you very much, Fene, for the introduction. So today I'm going to actually talk to you a little bit, I say a little bit about bark cloth, because the more I find out, the more I realize there is to know. What a huge and fascinating subject that it is. And I think that maybe I should call this part one. The information in this paper is based upon research and techniques developed and implemented at the studio, along with being sourced from many other areas, the internet, of course, many museums, and the Textile Centre in the University of Glasgow. All relevant contact details are attached on the acknowledgement page at the end of the paper. This talk will give an overview and an introduction to bark cloth, its fabrication, its use, alongside the conservation, storage, and safe display. Finding out about the history of who were the first people to use bark cloth has been challenging, as there is very little factual evidence written about the early days of production. There is reference to China as early as 6000 BC, and bark cloth is thought to be one of the first fabrics known to be made on the African continent, although its exact origins are lost in time. The Polynesian tapa tradition is very likely originated around 3000 years ago from the Lapita people who explored the Pacific and were the first people to penetrate into remote Oceania between 1100 and 800 BCE. It is believed that the same patterns used on the Lapita pottery and bark cloth and possibly tattoos are still evident in the tapa that are made in Polynesia today. I'm still finding evidence of early history and techniques, and this would be a never-ending task. But in the meantime, I thought to look at a few of the bark cloth items that the studio has conserved over the years and look at some of the bark cloth that is in the Lightfoot collections. Bark cloth is produced in many places, and I thought a good place to start is Africa and Uganda. Making bark cloth existed long before weaving, and I thought a good place to, and it was invented, making it one of the oldest textiles in history. Ugandan bark cloth production was spread throughout, but thrived in the Bugandan kingdom with workshops in almost every village. In the 18th century, it was declared by the king that the people should grow the mituba trees, commonly known as the Natal fig, and to make and wear bark cloth. The finest bark cloth was always reserved for kings, and it had a different finish and was often dyed black or white. Ugandan bark cloth traditionally, as with all bark cloths, was used in ceremonies, including coronations, funerals, as clothing, household items such as bedding and window screens. In the 19th century, Arab traders introduced cotton cloth to the region, and as the popularity of cotton grew, the production of the bark cloth declined, and there was fewer use for it, and the English government encouraged the growth of cotton in place of the bark cloth for trade. It was also during this time that with colonialism and the arrival of the missionaries, and with the efforts to shift cultural practices, that it lost its popularity. It was used in ritual activities, but the missionaries saw this as a sign of opposition to the belief system that they were trying to teach, and made local people reject bark cloth as confirmation that they had rejected their traditional ways. Bark cloth was associated with evil spirits because of its use in traditional burial ceremonies. However, the cloth continued to be used in spiritual and cultural ceremonies due to its significance. And from a practical point of view, the bodies would continue to be wrapped in them for burial to stop the termites from eating them. The missionaries called the cloth satanic and handed out imported textiles to be used instead. And in 1953, bark cloth became a symbol of resistance when the British arrested and sent King Mutesa II to England, and then it was worn to show solidarity to the king and express anger towards colonialism. Uganda gained its independence in 1962, but a mix of civil war, political crisis, and dictatorship saw the end of the Ugandan monarchy, as well as the bark cloth production. When the monarchy was restored in 1993, the coronation of the new king and the new interest in bark cloth was once again revitalized. It has now been recognized by UNESCO as a masterpiece of production and intangible heritage of Africa. Once the bark cloth has been removed from the tree, the outer layer is removed, leaving a sheet of inner fiber or a bast material. It is then pounded for several hours with a heavy wooden mallet until it is wider, thinner, smooth, soft, and malleable, and resulting in a fine texture. The cloth is then dried in the sun. Bark cloth is a viable trade on the international market for home furnishings, high fashion footwear, craft projects, book covers, along with paintings and handbags and even aerospace materials. It is creating jobs and is entirely sustainable. A piece of bark cloth, 75 by 1.50 m, can produce a piece of cloth measuring up to 4 meters by 1.80 m. Trees can be harvested annually for 30 to 40 years, producing up to 400 square meters of cloth. The mature bark is harvested every 5 years, allowing the tree to rejuvenate, and banana leaves are wrapped around the bark, which has been removed to protect it from insects and to maintain adequate moisture as the new bark grows. The top is a bark cloth beater from Uganda or Kenya, which is the early 20th century, and that's made from a redwood with a cane handle. And then the second one here is made, it's similar to the one which is actually being used in the beating of the cloth there. Sorry, it's not going. There we go. So the same technique that has been used by ancient craftsmen is still used today. There is a company known as Bartex who make bark cloth that is blended with other materials that makes it water repellent, fire retardant, and abrasive resistant, and is used as an alternative to leather or synthetic petroleum-based materials. Bark cloth is seeing a rise in interest as Ugandans are looking at it as a way to celebrate their culture. New uses for materials continue to be found, and people from around the world are just learning about this eco-friendly material. In addition to the economic benefits, Mabuti trees require limited water, they store carbon, the leaves provide food to livestock, and the figs dropped by the trees are eaten by the wildlife. Bark cloth is one of the cultural materials that has found a way to survive, despite the fact that much of Africa's authentic materials, cultures, and other regalia have been lost. Before the colonial era, bark cloth was the main item of men's and women's clothing in Central Africa. The cloths were originally used as loincloths for ceremonies, dance, and were also used as delivery blankets for babies, for newborn babies. The Mabuti people are one of the oldest indigenous people of the Congo. They are hunter-gatherers and they live in the Ituri rainforests. The smaller bark cloth pieces are made to size by beating a layer of tree bark from the fig tree or fibrous vines with a mallet made of bone, ivory, or wood in much the same way as all bark production. The women would choose the tree, and the preparation and the beating was done by the men. And once beaten, the cloth was used as a canvas by women who painted various abstract designs. The designs were symbolic, often depicting not only the vegetable and natural environment around, which included trees, vines, plants, but also included stars, insects, mammals, birds, as well as referring to objects that were used in daily life, such as combs, fans, and arrows. These patterns were often the same as the designs that were used in body painting, and that also included dots, lines, and circles. These are three of the bark cloths that we've actually got in the collection, which were made by the Mabuti people, and here are two more of the same collection. So to produce different colours, the bark cloth is immersed into tannic, rich black, red, or ochre mud, and this produces a tinted ground. The dye stuffs used for the painting include the powder of the heartwood of a red hardwood tree for red dye, wild turmeric root for yellow, and the ink or juice of the gardenia fruit mixed with charcoal to produce black, blue, and grey. Leaving the African continent, we moved to the South Pacific, where tapa was produced in Tonga, Solomon Islands, Samoa, Papua New Guinea, and as far afield as Java, New Zealand, and Hawaii. Much of the process of producing tapa and its uses are again similar to the processes that have been described previously. The name tapa is a universal term for Pacific cloth, and the tapa on these islands is mainly made from the paper mulberry tree, with some made from breadfruit and hibiscus. Bark cloth has always been a vital material in the social, cultural, and ritual lives of the Pacific Islanders. Tradition is still honoured, and tapa plays an important role in functions, ceremonial events, weddings, funerals, and gift presentations. And special designs are used to commemorate important events. Siapa is the name given to the bark cloth of Samoa. The paper mulberry tree stalks are harvested when they are about 10 to 14 months old, or approximately 1 or 2 inches in diameter. The bark is stripped and separated with a sharp knife. It consists of 2 layers. The outer bark is discarded by it being scraped away from the inner fibre or bast. The bast is then dried in the sun, then placed in fresh, clean water. The next step is further scraping, which removes any remaining bits of bark and growth. Further scraping is done using different types of clam shells, and each shell has a different degree of coarseness. A wooden beater, an ike, and a wooden anvil, tutua, are used for the beating by using the grooved side first and then the smooth side to finish off, resulting in a wide and fine paper-thin cloth. The tutua is approximately a 3-foot-long log used by one person, or one 6-foot-long log used by 2 to 3 people to beat the cloth. And once the beating process is finished, the bark cloth is put back into the sun to dry. Sorry, this is leaping a little forward, too much for me. The strips of bark are then beaten together into 2 layers with the assistance of a root crop glue, or sometimes tapioca starch. This piece is in the Lightfoot collection. It's a very large, the largest one we have, and it's from Tonga and known as a Nagatu. It's 4 meters 12 by 1 meters 83. It's either late 19th or early 20th century. There is some wear and a few holes. Other than that, it's in very good condition. The only thing I know about its provenance is that it was a gift to a previous owner from a Tongan fisherman in 1973 and was one of 40 which was folded up and stored under a bed. In Tonga, Hayapa is the name given to the paper mulberry tree, and that is what this piece is made of. The traditional design element used in siapo decorations are typically plant and animal motifs and other images of island life. More recent patterns include lettering to spell out names, events, or dates. Design motifs are specially represented within a grid created rectangular or oblong, as you can see here. So everything is always in the grids. You can see that very strongly here. In both Samoa and Tonga, in order to make large communal cloths, the work can involve an entire community. It is not uncommon to see groups of women working together on a huge sheet of tapa. These sheets can be around 3 meters wide and anything up to 60 meters long, depending upon the ceremony. These are 2 pieces that we were given for the study collection. The first one, I believe, is Samoan. The second one is Papua New Guinea, possibly Collingwood Bay, but both need further research. This edited information here on the dies comes from a study that was done by the Centre for Textile Conservation, Technical Art History and School of Culture and Creativity in Glasgow. Tapa painted cloth is painted using earthy colours such as reds, browns and blacks. The dyes are called Oa, Lama, Loe, Ago and So. Please forgive my pronunciation. Oa is the brown dye and is used as a base for all other dyes. It is extracted from the bark of the Bischoffia javanica or coca tree. The bark of the tree is scraped, the shavings collected and squeezed to produce the dye. Lama is the black dye, Leo is the red dye, and Ago is the yellow dye. As the brown dye ages, it darkens and it starts as a pale tan and matures into a very rich brown, which you can see on this one here. The black dye comes from the kernel of the candle nut. The candle nut is burned, the soot is collected, and it is mixed with the brown, which you get a much deeper color here. The red dye comes from a lipstick tree that produces pods filled with seeds. These seeds are mixed with the brown dye and the red is extracted. The yellow dye is extracted from turmeric root. The bark cloths studied here come from collections which are held at the Hunterian Museum, the Economic Botany Collection, the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and the Centre for Textile Conservation, Glasgow. Traditionally, colorants used to dye plain cloth were obtained from plants, trees, and earth pigments. And then with the arrival of missionaries and other Westerners saw a change in different dye stuffs with imported materials that were used. This is a cloth from Papua New Guinea. It was de-accessioned in the 1980s from the Pitt River collection, and I purchased it soon after. It's much, much more fibrous than Tonga and Samoan pieces, and it could be that it's made from a hibiscus fiber. I need to do more research on that piece. This is one of 2 tunics that we actually have from Bolivia. Both are bark cloth with geometric design on both sides, painted in brown, yellow with black maroon outline. They are sewn together at the sides with a hole cut in the neck and a line of decorative stitching, which is along the top of the neck here and also at the bottom of the tunic. They were worn by the Yuricay Indians, indigenous people from South America living in the Bolivian lowlands of the Amazon basin among the forests and near the plains near the Andes. The bark used is from the bibosi tree, which is another type of ficus. I bought these many years ago, and there was a note saying that they had been purchased by a Mr. Harris in 1845. This is the second one, and I quite like this, that it has a very neat patch in here, which is actually from bark cloth itself, and I rather like patches. I think they're rather good. This is an example of a Yurika Indian house, and it's taken from 1835. The traditional house was a large gabled roof that reached to the ground and was open both ends. The house was furnished with mats, mosquito nets, hammocks, and baby cradles, and all were made of bark cloth. And here you can see there's another example of one of the tunics that I've shown you there. So we go on to a different type of bark, and this is an image of a piece of lace bark that I bought from the late Pat Earnshaw's lace collection. Lagetta legato is a species of tree native to several Caribbean islands, including Jamaica and Cuba. It is also known as lace bark or the gorse tree. Lace bark was sourced from trees growing wild rather than cultivated, and it's unique among other tropical bark cloths in that it is produced without having to be beaten into shape. It was sourced from the trees. The inner bark is structured as a fine netting, and you can see that here. That has been used for centuries to make clothing as well as practical objects. The main steps of bark cloth fabrication are reasonably clear, but the methods are not well documented at all. The corky outer bark could be removed by hand, and the inner bark was gently extracted by pulling the layers apart. If the lace bark dried out too much during this process, it would be soaked in boiling water to restore the suppleness, and this also softened the lace bark by removing some of the natural stiffening matter. The separate netting would be stretched out and would expand at least 5 times of its original width. It was then bleached but bright white while the sun was drying. The harvesting was mainly worked by men, and the production was worked by women. In 1883, the French naturalist Félix Pouchet wrote that lace bark was as fine as our muslin, and even takes its place in the toilet of Our Ladies. Veils, shawls, dresses, aprons, caps, collars, frills, slippers, purses, other clothing and accessories have been made, mainly from the late 17th to the late 19th century. 2 monarchs of Great Britain were given lace bark clothing. Charles II received a cravat and ruffles, and Queen Victoria was presented a lace bark dress at the 1851 Great Exhibition. Lace bark has been used in the manufacture of household items, including curtains, hammocks, ropes, bridles, and whips. In the case of whips, the handles were made of the narrow tree branch with the outer bark still attached, while the whip tail was made from the twisted or braided strands of the lace bark that protruded from the same branch. Lace bark whips were unfortunately commonly used to punish slaves in Jamaica in the era before the abolition of slavery in 1833 to 1834. The use of the tree for textiles could have followed the arrival of slaves from West Africa, where there is a long tradition of bark cloth. The second half of the 19th century saw numerous appearances of lace bark items in industrial exhibitions, possibly because the British noticed a potential for increased production for Jamaica. By the 1880s, production appeared to have shifted to create tourist souvenirs, to create doilies, fans, etc. Production of lace bark items started trailing off in the early 20th century, largely because of the increasing rarity of the trees, but also partly due to the labor-intensive nature of the harvesting work and a decline of interest in tourist and traditional craft. Lace bark craft had nearly vanished by the 1960s, and an attempted revival in the 1980s was unsuccessful. So we go on to conservation. Conservation and ethical considerations. The studio works within the guidelines set out by ICON, the Institute of Conservation, and the ECCO, which is the European Confederation of Conservators and Restorers. So, conservation, a definition of the action of conserving something, the action of conserving something in particular, the prevention of decay, waste, or loss, the act of preserving, guarding, or protecting. Sorry, I've moved one on. I have a very sensitive computer here today. Preventative conservation includes an ongoing process that continues throughout the life of cultural property and does not end with interventive treatment. It is safeguarded and designed to look after objects through indirect action, ensuring that an object's environment is as close to ideal as possible. It is to extend the life of cultural property, to reduce the risk of loss, to defer, reduce, or eliminate the need of interventive treatment. It also can provide a cost-effective method for prevention and preservation of objects. There are standardized worldwide museum environmental guidelines for the bark cloth, and they are temperature 18 to 22, relative humidity is 45 to 55%. Acceptable ranges and limits of RH need to be based on the local climate, the nature and the condition of the object. Slow changes as a result of changing seasons are acceptable, but an environment that is continually fluctuating between dry and damp can put stress on the cloth and cause fibers to expand and contract in response. All objects should be assessed, and this can help to determine the appropriate recommended treatment, whether it is full or preventative. An assessment should take into consideration the region from where the cloth is from, the size, designs, colorants, and fibers. A condition survey will look at the physical qualities, including dirt, holes and tears, brittleness, discoloration, and the pH level. Once the condition is determined, a treatment program can be put into place, and this will include photographic documentation, decisions on cleaning, humidification, conserving, display, and storage. Textiles and the environment. This is a male waist wrap from Fiji, and it was collected by Captain Wilson on the journey, one of his journeys on the Duff. It's rather an extreme example of an unstable environment. It had been subject to flood damage after an intense heat after a fire at the Communal Museum in Walworth. You can see how the bark cloth has become misshapen and it's stained, and also the fringes are very, very out of shape. The environment that the bark cloth is kept in will dictate its condition. An inappropriate environment will contribute to the deterioration of the cloth. A good environment and reliable preventative and conservation methods will assist in slowing down the process of any deterioration. The long-term preservation of bark cloth is affected by numerous agents. They include light, incorrect relative humidity, incorrect temperature, pests, physical forces and pollutants, natural degradation, previous treatments, environmental factors, pests, use, incorrect display, and poor handling of storage. Efforts to control these agents of deterioration will have a positive and long-term effect on a collection. This is the same bark cloth, and it shows the changes after being given a humidity treatment and being kept in an ideal environment. Bark cloth, like all organic objects, is affected by the temperature and humidity. Temperatures that are too high or too low can directly influence changes in relative humidity. Dry conditions are less of a problem, but they can make the cloth brittle. Deterioration can be slowed down if the bark cloth is kept in a cooler climate. Low temperature only becomes a problem when it causes high relative humidity, and that causes damp. If there are no controlled environmental preventive measures that can be taken, silica gel is effective, where it controls the humidity by absorbing the moisture when it is too humid, and it deabsorbs the moisture when it's too dry. High relative humidity levels will encourage moth growth. At 70% RH, it takes 3 months or more for mold to develop. At 90% relative humidity, mold will develop in only a few days. Mold growth is unlikely to occur if the RH is below 60% and a good air circulation is maintained. This chart shows the breakdown of light. UV light 40%, visible light 25%, heat 25%, miscellaneous 10%. Light levels are measured with a lux meter. Recommended levels for bark cloth is less than 50 lux meters. Light damage, including sunlight, is cumulative and irreversible. Fibers weaken, become brittle. There is fading or changing color of both synthetic and natural dyes. Damage depends on the intensity of the light, the proportion of UV radiation, the length of exposure, sunlight, and some electric sources. It is the total light exposure that is important. An object will incur the same amount of damage from exposure to bright light for a brief period as from low light for a long period. For example, exposure at 100 lux for 400 hours will result in the same damage as exposure at 50 lux for 800 hours. Bark cloth is best exhibited under the lowest light intensity that allows for visual appreciation. Moving on a little, I was fortunate enough to be part of a workshop at the Textile Conservation Centre in Glasgow, which was part of an ongoing research project into tapa called Situating Pacific Bark Cloth, Production, Time and Place. It looked at the history, materials and processes of Samoan bark cloth production. We looked into various methods of conservation of bark cloth, and this is an image of a humidification process. Humidification allows the brittle bark cloth to relax and soften. This bark cloth was too creased to clean it before the process. It was unfolded, creases, and the folds were flattened out, as you can see here. And then the cloth was reshaped under weights, and we've used glass weights here. The humidification method, they range from localized humidification under a dampened blotter, which you can see here at the bottom here, that's actually a damp blotting paper, to constructing chambers to fit the size of the various pieces. Careful attention is paid to the presence of fugitive dyes. They are tested in discrete areas to determine the dye stability. After humidification treatment, the surfaces can be cleaned. This is researching further methods of testing structural support, spot cleaning, and poulticing of artificially soiled and distressed bark cloth samples. Cleaning can be done with using one or a combination of vacuuming with a variable controlled museum vac through a screen, the use of a soft brush, the use of vulcanized rubber, which is here, or using latex-free cosmetic foam wedges. And you can see here it shows the effectiveness of both of these two. And you can see the lower part on the sample is, in fact, there is an improvement on there. And it's also very satisfying to do because you can really see the dirt come off. This is some of the materials that are used for conservation treatments. The Queensland Museum has had a report that discusses the comparisons of tissue, materials, colour matching and adhesive testing. Materials chosen for the testing were various Japanese tissue papers for being the same type of the fibre as the bark cloth itself because of its compatibility, reme for its use in textile repairs, stability, flexibility and texture, spun bonded polypropylethylene for its use in ethnographical conservation and availability in its neutral colours. Tapioca starch, wheat starch, methylcellulose and glycol G were tested as potential adhesives for each of the samples. And here, these are the different types of samples of the adhesives that we were using. And here, these Procyon M dyes were the closest that we could actually get to the natural dyes for coloring the actual paper that we would be using. This is the before of a bark cloth, which we had in the studio. And then this is the completed tapa after the cleaning and a humidity treatment. It was then mounted on a stretcher for display. The losses were filled in from the back with toned Japanese paper with water-torn feathered edges. This stabilized and strengthened all the weakened areas. We used a wheat starch paste as it had good flexibility and reversibility. There are many ways to hang a tapa, but many of them cause damage. Using magnets is a good alternative to any stitching method, as stitching can cause damage and perforation marks, and this will eventually start to split in the same way that a postage stamp does, and that causes the separation of the bark cloth. There has been a lot of research into the benefits of displaying bark cloth with magnets, and both museums and the studio are using these methods. It has a lot less damaging and is less interventing. It allows the bark cloth to hang straighter and to evenly distribute the weight, allowing it to be viewed in a more satisfactory and pleasing way. The number of magnets used depends upon the size and the weight of the cloth. The magnets on the front of the object can be colored to the same color as the bark cloth. So this is coloring with tissue paper, and here are the magnets which are colored, and here luckily you don't see them at all. The reverse magnets are either attracted to a metal batten or tape, or they are countersunk into a wooden sealed batten, all made to the same size of the width of the cloth. The battens are secured to the wall. The magnets on the front are aligned to them. There is a barrier layer which is introduced in between so that the magnets are not in direct contact with the cloth. Smaller pieces of bark cloth can be framed, and glazing will protect them from dust. The magnet system can be, as above, can be used for hanging them inside the frame. All materials should be acid-free and conservation grade. UV screened glass or perspex glazing can be incorporated to protect the bark cloth from the UV content of daylight and artificial light. Bark cloth on open display will need to be cleaned occasionally, and this will be to remove the buildup of the dust. I'm very sorry about my slide show. Bark cloth on open display will need to be cleaned occasionally. This is to remove any buildup of dust that could be damaging in the long term. And this is best done with advice from a conservator. Storage methods and handling. Storage methods and storage environment is 45 to 55 degrees relative humidity and 15 to 20 degrees temperature, or colder if possible. Condensation can occur if there's a sudden drop in temperature, and adequate ventilation helps to prevent these problems. Use chemically stable materials such as acid-free card and tissue, archival foam boards, fluted plastic sheets, tissue, and scoured cottons. Ensure all UV is eliminated from light sources. Use window coverings to exclude natural light. Ideally, bark cloth can be stored flat, but that becomes a big space issue. Keep small pieces in acid-free boxes. Avoid ordinary cardboard boxes or wooden drawers. Wrap or interleave the pieces of bark cloth, tissue paper, or washed white cotton. Pad three-dimensional pieces with tissue paper to maintain their shapes. If a piece is too big to store flat, roll them on an acid-free cardboard roll or in an inert plastic-sized pipe that are several inches, which are longer than the width of the actual cloth. You can cover it with Melanex, and this will prevent creases setting in. Or you can cover an ordinary cardboard tube with polythene or aluminium foil, and then use a barrier layer, which is tissue or a cloth. Sorry, my slideshow has gone again. On the left are some of the Lightfoot collection pieces in storage. And as they are used for study purposes, I use Melanex covers so you can see what is there and you do not have to unroll them unless necessary. So my journey of conserving bark cloth over the years has been an exciting one. I've put this slide in as being able to spend time at Glasgow University was fascinating, and being taught how to produce bark cloth and to paint traditional Samoan design by Reggie Meredith Fieto, Professor of Art at American Samoa, was indeed my highlight. I'd like to thank everyone who's been involved in the project and for inspiring me even more about conserving bark cloth. I would also like to thank my wonderful team at the studio for all their hard work on conserving so many wonderful items that we had passed through the studio. And I would also like to thank my contemporaries within the textile conservation world for their support and inspiration. I would also like to say thank you to all of you for listening to my barking story, and I really apologize about my jumping slides. Here there are 2 pages of acknowledgements, which I think you'll find useful, and I thought we would end on this rather lovely picture from 1909, preparing bark cloth in Uganda. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. We